Good morning. Today, we're going to look at the Jewish backgrounds in first century Jewish society. The Gospels were clearly written from a Jewish frame of reference and portray a Jewish worldview, specifically of first century Israel. The roots of replacement theology began springing up in the second century AD and came into full strength in the 4th century. The larger church severed itself from the Jewish origins of the New Testament faith, leading to the present state of the Christian church, meaning denominationalism galore. We have over 1,000 different denominations. And theologic confusion. Jesus was Jewish. He spoke Hebrew. He lived his entire life as a religious Jew. And when we discover these Jewish roots, excuse me, and the Jewish understanding of phrases and terminology, you get a clearer understanding of the messages in the Gospels, and I love that. We must take into consideration rabbinic literature and the New Testament is going to just come alive. We tend to look at things so broadly and circumspectly that we don't get just the finite, clear, simple understanding of the gospel and the Bible. That's my experience. First century Judaism was diverse. There were many different categories of Jewish sect. What we know today as what's a normal type of Judaism only developed after 70 AD, when the Jews were scattered abroad. Pharisaic Judaism was dominant prior to 70 AD, and it had the general support of the Jewish population in Israel. The first group that opposed Jesus were Pharisees. The word Pharisee means separated. This sect flourished from the beginning of the 1st century BC, like I think that would mean 100 BC to 100 AD, what's called the end of the 1st century AD. Pharisees were the driving force, putting the oral law, oral traditions on the same level of authority as the written law, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. By elevating the oral law, they put themselves in opposition to the second group we hear about in the New Testament is the Sadducees. So they were opposed to many of the things the Sadducees believed. But the Pharisees were the shapers of rabbinic Judaism, which develops in its final form after 70 AD. But it was a dominant representative of Judaism during the Gospel period. Pharisees believed in the immortality of the soul, the existence of angels, divine providence, freedom of will, and resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead will occur at the time of the coming of the Messiah. They say this: God predestined everything except the free will of man. Their influence included governmental control of the courts, taxes, foreign affairs. Josephus says Their interpretation of the scriptures shaped all prayers and sacred rites of divine worship. Extremely influential. The Sadducees were the second most, I guess you could say, important group that opposed Jesus in the Gospels. This sect flourished during the Second Temple period, starting with the Hasmonean kingdom and dynasty, which we studied a few lessons ago, with the Maccabees, etc. at that time. But the Second Temple was the temple of Zerubbabel, the temple that was built after their Babylonian captivity was over. During Jesus's time, almost all priests were Sadducees, and they disappeared from Jewish life after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So the Sadducees were led by aristocratic and priestly families who often stood in strong opposition to the Pharisaic interpretation of Mosaic law and scripture. They were against, they only accepted the written law, and they rejected the oral law that the Pharisees elevated to such a high degree. They rejected the authority of the sages, which we're going to talk about more. Although Sadducees controlled the temple, Pharisees continued to practice rituals and sacrifices required by Mosaic law and rabbinic tradition. While the Pharisees, they had a type of a passive resistance to Rome. They fiercely opposed Rome, but they resisted it more passively. And on the other hand, the Sadducees, they completely cooperated with Rome and worked with them and actually benefited from their association with Rome and didn't want to upset that apple cart. So they didn't want Jesus coming and changing that balance of power, I guess you could say. Sadducees rejected Jesus. The main reason was that they disagreed with resurrection. That's why they are sad, you see. Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. They did not believe, as I said, in opposing Rome, and the temple was under Sadducean control. Another religious sect were the Essenes. They were a sect that impacted first century Judaism. Although they're not mentioned in the New Testament, they are a diverse element of Pharisaism. So they are considered to be extreme Pharisees. For them, it was a sacrilege to practice Mosaic law at the temple in Jerusalem as long as it was under Sadducean control, because the priesthood, in their opinion, was of a non-Zadok line, Zadokite line from David. They chose mainly a policy of separation, although in Jerusalem there was a group of Essenes living in Jerusalem. There was a gate called the Essene Gate. But the ones that separated into isolated areas like Qumran are, again, the Essenes. Another Jewish sect, we don't usually think of it as that, is the Samaritans. They do play a minor role, but yet they are also significant in the Gospels. They are of mixed origin. These are the Jews who came out of Assyrian captivity. Now, when Samaritans returned to Jerusalem, the Jews would not allow them to help rebuild the temple. because Samaritans had also mixed with the Gentiles via marriage, but also spiritually there was a mix of religions. There's some elements of Judaism, but also of paganism. And this conflict between Jews and Samaritans was very real, and it had existed 450 years before Jesus' ministry. Today, the Samaritan population in Israel has been reduced to somewhere around 1,000 people. So there are close family marriages that go on. And then another Jewish sect are the Herodians. They play a minor role in the Gospels, and they're mentioned only in Matthew and Luke. This group was willing to accept Roman rule over Israel as long as it came through the family of Herod, the house of Herod. Herodians were seen in collusion with the Pharisees, whom normally they don't have a great affinity for, but they were brought together to ask Jesus particular questions about taxes. That was the issue that drove them together, Roman taxation. And you see that in Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 and on to 22. It says, quote, "Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him, Jesus, in his talk, and they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, quote, 'Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?'" And Mark 12, verse 13 and on, says, Then they sent to him, Jesus, some Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. So the Herodians had more of an affinity, more similarities to their beliefs with Sadducees and with Pharisees. Then another Jewish sect is Zealots, also known as Sicarii, Sicarii. They were part of a movement that Josephus calls the Fourth Philosophy. They were extreme Pharisees who had a belief in very active resistance to Rome. And eventually they brought the nation to war in AD 66 to 70. Zealots would even kill Jews who were collaborating, working on behalf of Rome. The disciple of Jesus, Simon, he was called Simon the Zealot, was a zealot. He was of that persuasion. The name Sicarii, Sicarii, is Latin for assassin. Upon his death, Simon was supposed to have been sawed into longitudinally from head to toe. The other and last sect of Judaism are what the rabbinic rabbis called Am Haaretz. It literally means the people of the land or country folk. The name was given in rabbinic literature to a person who, through ignorance, was careless in the observance of the laws and Levitical purity. They were uncultured, so to speak. And they were the mass of the people, of the populace at that time. And the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, so this group supported the Roman government only to a degree. Not to get too much involved into the Jewish language at the time, but interesting thing about that is when the Jewish people went into captivity, There's an understanding that they may have largely forgotten Hebrew, and it was only used in a ceremonial way. But more recently, this assumption has been challenged. When they look at literary and epigraphic evidence, that raises questions about if that was true or not. We know that most Jewish people who are outside of the United States, are multilingual. They know 2 or 3 languages. That's pretty common. And another interesting point that I learned is Hebrew and Aramaic are closely related to one another as Dutch and German are. So if they picked up the Aramaic language when they were in Babylon, so to speak, they could easily have recovered their Hebrew as well. All the early rabbinic literature was written in Hebrew, written closest to the time of Jesus. All rabbinic parables are in Hebrew, and Jewish prayers were prayed in the Hebrew language. 95% of the Dead Sea Scrolls were in Hebrew. And even holy books like the Torah and the Gospels were generally written in Hebrew. Why assume Jesus was limited to one language? So Hebrew was more commonly used at the time of Jesus. When Jesus spoke to Pilate, likely he would have spoken Greek. And it is safe to conclude Jesus was at least a trilingual. He spoke Hebrew, number 1, number 2, Aramaic, number 3, Greek. So the temple in Jesus' day was constructed by Zerubbabel when the Jews returned from captivity, but it was thoroughly renovated and glorified by Herod the Great. It's still considered to be the second temple. Herod's temple is still considered to be the second temple. And it was the center of Jewish religious and spiritual life. The office of the priesthood, according to Exodus chapter 29, verse 9, the office of the high priest was to be inherited, passed down from Aaron to his sons and then their sons. At the time of the Gospels, the priesthood was largely Sadducean, but they were still descendants of Aaron. Under the Roman occupation, Roman governors and procurators, they either appointed or deposed high priests. Both Annas and Caiaphas were appointed by Rome. The Romans kept the choices they made to the descendants of Aaron. There were temple police. The captains are also known as the captains of the temple, because no Gentile could enter the inner court on penalty of death. They maintained order in the inner court, and they play a role in Jesus' arrest and trial. Where did synagogues come from? Well, they did not exist in the Old Testament, or also known the Hebrew Bible. Exactly where and when the first synagogue was established is unknown, but it is widely understood and presumed that synagogues were established during the Babylonian captivity. And it became a vital element of Judaism. So people got together in synagogues, mostly for teaching and also for worship. By the end of the 1st century BC, there were synagogues not only in Babylon, but also in Alexandria, Egypt, and throughout Israel. The Talmud speaks of 400 synagogues in Jerusalem alone in AD 70. So let's talk about the development of Pharisaic, also known as Rabbinic Judaism, also known as Orthodox Judaism. Some major changes occurred in Judaism between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. There are no mention of synagogues, rabbis, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, Herodians in the Hebrew Bible. All these things just seem to appear without introduction in the New Testament. When the first group of sages, we'll call them sages, began when Ezra led the return of Israel to the Jewish people to Israel after the Babylonian captivity. So he began a school of the scribes, also known as Sophrim, Sopherim. They were teachers. He was a priest, Ezra was, and a scribe. He was expert in the words of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes to Israel. Now they understood, the spiritual leaders understood, that the reason for the Babylonian captivity was disobedience to the law of Moses. So when they came back, Ezra led a campaign to be able to teach each of the 613 commandments, explain them to the Jewish people, what was involved in keeping or breaking each commandment. By giving the Jewish people this knowledge, hopefully they will not, the scripture says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. That's Hosea 4, verse 6. Ezra's goal was to overcome that lack of knowledge. So they their work got underway, and when the first generation of Sophrim scribes passed away, there were following generations of Sophrim that took the task more seriously. They decided that it was no longer enough to merely explain the Torah. Now the goal was to build a fence around it. More rules and regulations. By building the fence, they could prevent a Jew from breaking any of the original 613 laws and avert and avoid another divine judgment. The fence would consist of new regulations, new requirements, and if a Jew might break that, the rabbinic law, that would still keep him from breaking the Mosaic law. This is a quote from them. If a person comes too close to a fire, he can be burned. The same is true of the Torah. If one does not observe the fences and boundaries set by our sages, one can be burned by their coals as with fire. However, if we keep the proper distance, we can enjoy it. So they set up a fence. Sophrim, they believed the Torah was given by God to Moses. There was no debate there. However, in making new rules, the Sophrim could disagree and debate among themselves until a decision was made by majority rule. Once the majority of the Sophrim made a ruling on a specific new regulation, if they all agreed, it became mandatory for all Jews to follow. Truth was now being determined by a majority vote and not by the actual words of Scripture. Rabbinic enactments Well, I think that just means guidance. It was a step-by-step guidance. So, the Sophorim did not make rules and regulations haphazardly. They used a form of rabbinic logic called pilpul, P-I-L-P-U-L, a term which means peppery or sharp. A dialectic argument. They used legal casuistry, sophisticated case analysis, and hypothetical possibilities. They said, how many new rules can we logically derive from one commandment, from the original statement? Here is an example of what happened. There was a commandment, do not seethe or boil a baby goat, baby goat, in the milk of its mother. In all probability, that law was given to avoid a Canaanite practice at the time of Moses. When a goat gave birth to its first born kid or little baby goat, the Canaanites would take the kid away from its mother, milk the mother, and then boil the meat of the kid in the milk of its mother as a first fruits offering to Baal. Baal was a smiting god that lived, or they worshipped, around 1300 BC. So Jews were not supposed to practice that kind of idolatry, so they were not to seethe the kid in its mother's milk. God gave that commandment to Moses around 1400 BC. Now, the sages looked at it, and 1,000 years later, around 400 BC, there was no Canaanites around anymore. None was boiling kids in its mother's milk since a great while. And so the original intent of that commandment had really no longer was applicable. But in the school of Sophorim, that question arose. And you'll see how they do this extreme analysis. So we need to make sure we never, ever, ever, never boil a kid in its mother's milk. Suppose you eat a piece of meat, and with the piece of meat, you drink a glass of milk. Is it possible that the milk is from the mother of the meat you're eating? And as you swallow it both, it mixes in your stomach, and you're seething together in your stomach. And so there was a new law that came into being. A Jew cannot eat meat and dairy at the same time. There must be separated by 4 hours at least. Suppose at noon you choose to eat a dairy meal. You take a plate and you eat some cheese. After you eat the cheese, you wash that plate thoroughly, you scrub it. But there just might be a tiny speck of cheese still left on the plate that you did not see. In the evening, you choose to eat meat, and you place the meat on the same plate on which you ate the cheese earlier. The meat might pick up that tiny speck of cheese, no matter how remote. It just might be possible that the cheese you had at noon was made from the milk of the mother of the meat you're eating later in the day. As you swallow that tiny speck of cheese with the meat, you seethe the kid in its mother's milk, and you violate the Torah. Thus, a new commandment came out. Every Jew must have 2 sets of dishes, and one is for cheese and dairy, one is for meat. If you accidentally use that wrong dish, you either must destroy it or give it to a Gentile. But no Jew can ever eat from that platter, ever, never. So each of the 613 commandments God gave Moses The Sopharim, the first group of sages, added multiple hundreds and hundreds of new rulings and regulations. So the period of Sopharim, that's plural, Sophar, singular, began in 400 BC and ended at 30 BC. And that period is based on key rabbis. The rabbis of that period are Ezra to Hillel. So that's the beginning of the tradition, also known as the oral law. Because guess what? All these new regulations were not written down until 220 AD. The Jewish people practiced memorization, and they memorized all those rules and regulations, passed it on to successive priests. Certain priests, or called the scribes, there were scribes and Pharisees in Jesus' day. All they did was memorize. But that isn't the end of the story, because they continued to create another group of sages, began from Hillel to Judah the prince. That was the name of the rabbi, also known Yehuda Hanasi. So Tanaim, plural for Tana, the Tanaic, also called Tanaic literature, rabbinic literature, began from 30 BC to 220 AD. So the Tanaim ended at 220 AD, when they had decided, since they were fewer in number after Roman destruction of the temple and Israel and Jerusalem and all that, they decided to finally write them down. So again, the Tanaim looked at that fence and they said, oh no, there's still too many holes in the fence. So from that time, the time after Hillel, so from Hillel to Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the prince, they added more rules and regulations, because there were too many holes in the fence. So they added more rules and regulations for 2.5 more centuries. However, they changed their principle of operation. They said a sofer, the first group called Sopharim, a sofer can disagree with a sofer, but he cannot disagree with the Torah. The Torah, of course, is sacrosanct. But now the Tanaim, the Tanas, elevated the work of the Sopharim, and they said, a Tana can disagree with a Tana, but you cannot disagree with what the Sopharim laid down. What the Sopharim's work was sacrosanct, meaning equivalent with Scripture. This is a quote from a rabbi. If you disregard the enactments of the scribes, it's more severely dealt with. You'll be more severely dealt with than disregard of the injunctions of the law of Moses. A judge must apply a greater stringency to the observance of Sopharim rulings than those of the law. So they began a new doctrine, a doctrine called of the two Torahs, of two Torot, two laws. It is said that God gave Moses 2 bodies of commandments on Mount Sinai. The first was the written law. It contained the 613 commandments, which Moses wrote down in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The second law was called the oral law, call that because Moses didn't write it down. These thousands of additional rules, but simply committed them to memory. And so the oral law, sometimes called the oral Torah or the second Torah or the oral tradition, was also revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and according to the sages, it explains the written Torah. So you cannot understand the written law without the oral law. Apparently, they believe Moses passed it down to Joshua. Joshua passed it down to judges, the judges to the prophets, and prophets to the Sopharim. So they taught that the Sopharim, this is what the Tanaim said. The Tanaim group are the ones that elevated the Sopharic rules and regulations. And they started saying, oh no, the Sopharim did not originate all the new rules. They simply got them from the prophets. That's why they are co-equal with Scripture. Okay. That gives you an idea of where this extreme exegesis is what the rabbis do, which the New Testament writers did not do. So the scribes are those Pharisees who had committed all these rulings to memory. They could be the ones who would declare what had been handed down. What does the tradition say about this or that? Well, those guys would be the experts at that. And the rabbis knew that forgetfulness was their most dangerous enemy. So in trying to prevent the oral law from falling into oblivion, they elevated it, putting it on the same level of importance as the scriptures. And another quote says, every man who forgets a single word of his Mishnah. The Mishnah is what the scribes and the Tanaim, their work, collection of their work is called Mishnah, okay? There's still another work to go, another group to go. But they said this, every man who forgets a single word of his Mishnah. The word Mishnah means memorization. Accounts it unto him as if he had forfeited his soul. Another quote is, repetition is the mother of learning. The rabbis passed on numerous rules of memorization. So as history comes to the 3rd century AD, there are less and less Jews still in the land, as I said, due to Roman occupation. So less and less people were available to maintain and upkeep all these oral traditions via memory. So that's when finally the leader, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, overruled the prohibition of writing all these traditions down, and that brought the period of the Tanaim to an end, AD 220. But there's another period to go. That is the period of 220 AD to 500 AD, and that is a group called the Amora, Amora, and the plural is Amoraim. That's called the finished product. They finished the work. So what the Amoraim did, they looked at the work of the Tanaim. So they took the work of the Tanas, the previous group of sages, and made a commentary on that. And that's called the Gemara, Gemara. So that went on again. The same thing happened. They elevated the work of the Tana to sacrosanct, and then the Amoraim became more of a, I'm trying to think of a word here. So, commentary. There we go. And the Gemara is the work product of the Amorim. And what it means Gemara, Gemara, means learning and completion. It is that part of the Talmud. Now, the Talmud contains the Mishnah, which is one group of writing, and the Gemara. And there are two compilations of the Talmud. There was a Babylonian Talmud, where the sages were in Babylon. There was also a Palestinian Talmud, later renamed Talmud of the State of Israel. The Mishnah had 1,500 pages in and of itself, but when you add that to the Gemara of the Babylonian Gemara, it is very extensive. It is basically, looks like an encyclopedia. And the Babylonian Talmud is the major focus of rabbinic studies to this day. The Babylonian Talmud was the most, famous of the works. Okay, so that is the teaching of the rabbis. Our rabbis taught. It has been said, it has been taught. And they made supplements as well. A Baraitha, Baraitha, is an extraneous Mishnah. So, or also known as the Apocrypha of the Mishnah. These rabbis were engaged in two types of discussions, usually ethical and legal. The ethical is called the Agadah. The legal ones are halakha. So, now, our lesson is done for the day, but we're going to continue on. This was a little longer tape with what Jesus had to confront in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is what Jesus confronted and challenged the Pharisees about. Thank you. Have a great day, and God bless you.